get going?
Sure.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for attending this session this morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and we've heard some amazing presentations already, I think, this morning. So hopefully this discussion will build on some of the things that we've touched on in some of the earlier sessions. And I'd like to welcome my panel as well. So thank you very much indeed for agreeing to speak this morning. I thought we'd start by recapping, or at least building on one or two of the comments that we've heard this morning. And I'd like to start really by thinking about the tipping point in mobility. And I think Dr. Sid mentioned it first of all, said that it feels as if we're at a bit of a tipping point in mobility. And I really liked Jamie's presentation just now. And I think gave us a sort of a snapshot of some of the things that are coming. So I'd like to ask our panel to think about whether we truly are at a tipping point for mobility, and whether in 10 years' time we're all going to be doing something completely different. And whilst they're thinking about that, I'd like to use the mobile telecoms market as an example. So in the early 90s, a few people had mobile phones. They certainly weren't ubiquitous, and they were very much used just for making telephone calls. 10 years later, 2003, you have the iPhone, you have the App Store. Mobile phones are completely ubiquitous, and they've transformed how we use these devices in our hands. So, are we at the point now in mobility where we are going to be radically using mobility in a different way in the next 10 years? Perhaps Martin, maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, again, I like the presentation before because it highlighted that it's not all about the car. It's not all about the automobile. We need to think more about how we as human beings interact. I always ask when I present on mobility is, if I ask the audience here, where do you actually feel, if I asked you where do you feel most happy in terms of your environment, whether it's in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or other parts of the world, with your families, where do you actually feel the happiest? And it's unlikely that it will be sitting behind the wheel of your car. I know personally I don't enjoy sitting in a traffic jam waiting in the traffic. My happiest times tend to be when I'm walking with my family. We feel safe, secure, that we don't have any risks from traffic nearby and the noise and so on. And I think this is crucial to how we're going to plan our cities. I think that the point made about the cities starting to ban vehicles from the center is absolutely spot on. So if we're looking to the future, I think it's an absolute privilege right now that we're allowed to drive our cars in the center of cities, and it's actually affecting us as human beings and how we interact in those spaces. So for me, it's definitely about moving away from the private vehicle and much more towards what we would call a livable city. If you think about the cities that are in the top ranked livable cities, you may have heard of The Economist and the Mercer rankings of cities. The top cities are the ones where it is walkable, where it is cyclable, and it's easy for people to move around. It's not the cities where it's very easy to drive around. So to answer your question, it's much more about getting back to a human scale, not worrying too much about technology at this stage, just bringing it back to us as human beings and making sure that we are protected and safe in our space.
Okay. So from what you're saying, actually, the step change will be fewer vehicles, more other stuff in terms of mobility.
Certainly within our city centres. So where the majority of the people are living and working, I see that as the way forward. I think inevitably, and I'm sure some of my panelists will talk about this as well, but the movement towards autonomous vehicles is going to have a profound shift in how we plan cities and how cities operate. So, for example, it suddenly becomes easier. One of the panel sessions earlier mentioned about would he feel safe putting his children into an autonomous car to get them to school and back. And inevitably, it's going to be, that tipping point is going to happen, that people will actually say it is safer to be in an autonomous car rather than to have someone driving. The accident rates are going to go down with autonomous vehicles. And to have that step change is going to make people think, well, I don't necessarily need to live in the city centre, and I can start to move out of the city centre. And then the planning has to start thinking about, well, you're going to get a shift and a spread of all the people and how that operates. So I think there's two things. One, about making the cities for people, and two, there's a fundamental shift in how our cities are planned, taking account of new technology when it comes through.
Okay, fantastic. Vitaly, perhaps we'll come to you. I mean, you work for Frost & Sullivan, so you conduct an awful lot of research into mobility and how mobility will evolve over time. What are your thoughts on this sort of step change in how things are moving?
It's a good question. As to say if we are at the tipping point, it's a difficult question. If we just look at the automotive market, then definitely we see people moving away from private ownership towards shared mobility, shared ownership structures. If we look globally, just at the 2018, the U.S. automotive market is flat. European automotive market is flat. Chinese car market has dropped for the first time in 20 years. The Middle Eastern market is not doing extremely well as well. So we do see signs that people are trying to explore new solutions, new mobility options. And that is particularly noticeable in the Middle East for one particular reason, and that reason is extremely young population. So if we look at the local population, I'll take an example of Kuwait. The median of population is between 20 to 24 years old. If we look at the overall, including expats, the median population is about 30 to 34 years old. So it's extremely young. What's interesting about the young generation, young people, they like to explore new options. They like new solutions. And as somebody mentioned before, they like services which are available to them now. They want services, they want them immediately. And if we look at the Middle East and the GCC mobility structure at the mobility market, we've seen some services we have been doing extremely well, such as Uber, Careem. Now we have UDrive or eCar, which have been picking up quite tremendously within the last few years. Not sure if too many people know, but Dubai is globally one of the 50 cities in the world which have been launching the demand responsive transit. So it's a solution which brings mass transit closer to people. So all the things that are happening now, whether it will take 5 years, it will take 10 years, it's difficult to say. From the market perspective, from the numbers standpoint, all of these shared services that we are looking at, we are expecting double-digit growth in the next 5 to 7 years. Demand responsive transit is likely to grow at a triple-digit rates. So we are seeing incredible growth, but we need to remember it takes time. If we look at the car sharing options, I'm not sure if people know or pay attention, but one of the biggest ones in the world is the Car2Go, owned by Daimler. It was launched 10 years ago, so it took them 10 years to develop to where they are now. And it's still difficult because they had to merge with the BMW sharing services. So it's still taking effort, it requires time, and what's more, it requires education on the customer's behalf, because customers are not always aware of what's available as of now.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. Andrew, perhaps we'll move to you. I mean, we've heard in what Martin said, what Vitaly said, I think that there will be some winners and losers over the next 10 years. Maybe traditional vehicle manufacturing will lose out, maybe ideas like car sharing will pick up. I mean, where do you think the winners and losers are going to be over the next 10 years?
That's a very interesting question. I think there's a number of different answers to that. If you talk about the decline in car ownership, I think that's a trend that we're seeing in a lot of the major cities around the world. And in terms of accelerating that, I think it'll be dependent on a number of factors. And we're seeing the OEM manufacturers now embracing this. They're changing their business model. People like Mercedes, for example, they understand that there may be less car sales in the future, so they're embracing the carpooling opportunities. They're partnering with Via Van to provide carpooling in certain cities around the world. I think as well cities will also start to adapt. We've talked about the adoption of autonomous vehicles and how that will affect, and who will be the winners and losers in that? Well, we already have congested cities. When we start introducing autonomy into our congested roadways, and we used the example earlier of people putting their children in autonomous vehicles, that then increases the amount of vehicles on the road, potentially increasing vehicle miles traveled. Therefore, you may see an increase in congestion. So we will then need to look at the infrastructure that's provided and how we plan our cities in the future to accommodate these new types of technology, new types of mobility. And I think the way that the authorities will start addressing this will have to be very different. It'll have to change. Personalisation of mobility is also becoming more and more important with things like mobility as a service, where consumers no longer want or necessarily desire to have their own car. They understand, I do question your statement there actually, that I believe that consumers do now want a personalised service. They want an on-demand service, particularly the young generation. They think about sustainability, they think about their carbon emissions. I mean, even within Dubai, you have the example of places like Jumeirah Lakes Towers, for example, where they have modified their parking strategy around that area. They've increased the parking charges, and now it becomes more affordable to use something like Uber to go in and out of that area rather than driving yourself and parking your car. So now people are starting to look at different options and different personalised services to address their needs of mobility.
Okay, thank you. Ross, you come from Honeywell, which is essentially a technology company, so perhaps not one that people automatically think of when they think of mobility. But how is Honeywell, tapping into the new opportunities in the mobility space?
So when we talk about the definition of a smart city, everybody has a very different definition, but the one constant in that is technology. And technology will be a fundamental enabler for a lot of the themes that we're talking about just now. Will it be the next big tipping point? I don't think so, actually. I think there have been tipping points. Uber came about because of the access to the mapping data and everybody having access to data on their telephones. I think the next big tipping point here is not going to be a tech point. That's our view. So there are big hopes around 5G. There's big hopes around new battery technology. But it seems to us that the next big tipping point will be collaboration between the different stakeholders in this space. Mm-hmm. And I'm the only non-consultant here at the moment. I feel very sorry for you guys because I think you've got a very, very difficult job. You're coming from a place where cities were traditionally planned by civil engineers and it was a very sort of heavy infrastructure focus. Tomorrow's cities have got a very strong technology backbone to them and there'll be very quick moving pieces. And I think what will make technology successful in that is that when people are collaborating around it to get the most of it. Mm-hmm. So we've seen the OEMs, as Andrew says, move into providing autonomous technology in their vehicles, but that really has to link back into what the authorities are providing in the infrastructure. Yeah. Second on my feeling sorry for list is the authorities. I think they've got a very difficult job to enable our cities to be ready for this. And I can see them catching up with legislation and this type of thing. So we're very positive about the role of technology. It's going to be fundamental to enabling smart cities, but our view is that there's a lot that has to go around it to make it successful and to get the most potential out of it.
Okay, thank you. Nadeem, I mean, we've moved on to the area of technology, and I know that's your area of speciality at Oricon. I mean, how do you see the role of technology changing the way that we use and we experience mobility?
I think the definition of future mobility, as my colleague just mentioned, is different for everyone. As a transport planner, for me, mobility or smart mobility or future mobility basically consists of three elements. Element number one is the transport mode. Element number two is the infrastructure, which is the physical infrastructure. And element number three is how do you connect them together. I think smart mobility and future mobility is just about how you connect your modes and your existing or future infrastructure or physical infrastructure together. So if you see what is happening in the mode space, there is significant disruption, transformation happening in the modes. We have got autonomous cars, we have got driverless metros, we have got group rapid transit coming in, we have got this e-shared mobility, scooty. But this is all really happening in the mode space. But if you see in the physical infrastructure space, you cannot really change the road network of the whole city in a couple of years' time. You cannot change the bridges and interchange. So I think this is where technology is going to play a very, very important role to connect the transformation which is happening in the mode space. I think one thing was, we were talking about autonomous cars as well, and someone said, would someone be comfortable sending their kids on an autonomous car? To be very honest, all the metro system in Dubai or anywhere in the world is driverless. Mm-hmm. People are very comfortable sending their kids on a metro system, but why they are not comfortable in sending their kids to the autonomous cars? It is again because of the lack of technology and lack of information which we have as of today. So autonomous cars or driverless vehicles, again driverless vehicle and autonomous cars and technology is nothing so new. The experiment on autonomous cars are happening since 1920. The first pilot run of autonomous car was done in 1950 by RCA, which is Radio Corporation of America. But I think since the disruption was happening very slow, no one really noticed. But I think after Google came in 2009 with the Waymo project, all out of sudden over the last 10 years, everyone is talking about autonomous cars, and autonomous vehicles. So whether we go with the shared mobility or we go with the shared mobility, we reduce the number of cars, we cannot deny the fact that cars or vehicles will still be on ground, okay, even in the future. So the main thing is that how do we develop that technology? We can efficiently connect those future modes with the existing infrastructure. And again, it comes back to the point of data and artificial intelligence and everything. If I take example of an autonomous car, for autonomous car to operate in a mixed environment, there are 3 layers of interaction. For an autonomous car to operate in a mixed environment, there are 3 levels of interactions which are required. The level 1 is autonomous car should be able to interact with its own machine, which we call it autonomous behavior. The second thing is autonomous car should be able to interact with the humans sitting within the car as well as those who are walking outside the car. And the third layer is autonomous vehicle should be able to interact with the infrastructure around it. It could be V2V, vehicle to vehicle infrastructure, or V2I, which is vehicle to infrastructure, which is the hardcore physical infrastructure. So all these things can really happen with the use of technology and with the use of artificial intelligence. And I think when we talk about autonomous cars to operate, the amount of data which will be required for autonomous cars to operate, which will be so significant that with the current 4G technology, the maximum download speed is 20 MB per second. But with that kind of a speed, you cannot really operate autonomous cars, because autonomous car has to interact with every other node and every other device in the system. So you need a kind of 5G technology. To answer your question, technology is really going to play a very, very critical and important role. If we don't have the technology to a level where we are comfortable to send our kids in an autonomous car, I don't think we have reached a future mobility component yet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I should say that I do want this session to be as interactive as possible, so we'll try and give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask questions. And I know there's a lot of experience and insight and knowledge out there in the room. So I'll open this session up to questions in just a second. But I mean, my personal view is that the amount of investment in mobility at the moment, the embedded investment in mobility, whether it's in infrastructure or vehicles, or even some of the research that's happening now, means that it's almost certain that there won't be a radical change within 10 years, just because that sort of disruption would not only would destroy industries, but it would destroy economies as well. So I think my personal view, and again, I'm very open to being challenged on this, is that we will see more of an evolution rather than a revolution in mobility, despite what we're being told and some of the hype and some of the sort of visionary thinking. I think the visionary thinking is great, and I think we need it, but I think in 10 years' time, I think we'll still be getting in our cars on our own. I think most of us will still be driving our own cars, and probably we'll still be driving cars with petrol engines, I'd imagine. But again, open to be challenged on that. Any response to that view?
I think you mentioned 10 years. To be very honest, it's very difficult to really predict whether it's 10 years, or it could be in 2 years, or it could be not even 50 years. So again, coming back to the point is, unless or until we are comfortable with the technology which is required for these future mobility components to work, it will be very difficult to feel comfortable and safe to basically send your kids or even send yourself into a mixed environment, making a trip. So I think it's all about getting back to technology, and Martin said the human interaction as well. Obviously, human comes first, but technology, if it's not there, then it's very difficult even to satisfy the human requirements. And getting back to your point of economy, I think someone said the economy might be impacted if it happens overnight. But we'll have to see the other side of economy as well. You have to imagine that economic losses which are happening in terms of congestion, the moment you move to the future mobility, okay, in Dubai about 500,000 trips are made during the peak hour. And the travel time losses in Dubai is about 1 hour, and the value of time of Dubai was 68. If you multiply them together, so in single peak hour, you are losing millions of dirham in economy. So imagine if you convert those losses and replace them with future mobility and shared mobility and put them in public transport and use driverless techniques, obviously those losses can be minimized and you can use them efficiently doing something else better.
It's a very good point. So maybe there are benefits that sort of latent benefits that we're not yet seeing. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Has anybody got any thoughts or views perhaps on where mobility is heading in the next 5 to 10 years? Yes, the gentleman at the back there. Can we get a microphone to him, please? We got someone with a microphone?
I think the microphone's on the stage, isn't it?
Is it? Okay. But maybe just
Nadeem, you'll have
it's
to
a
run
relatively
down.
small room. Maybe stand up and speak a bit louder. Yes.
That's fine.
My name is Mohammed Arshi, and I'm a CEO with one of the Toyota companies based in Dubai. Thank you. That's better. So, just a couple of points based on the discussions we've been hearing since morning. I think, going back to your point where you said, where are we? Are we at a tipping point? I think we as an industry, there are too many thought leaders right now who are trying to figure out where will we be 5 years or 10 years down the line? Because I think the next 5 or 10 years will determine how the next 50 years of civilization will move, right? And I don't think anybody has figured out the final answer yet. And while electric vehicles form, a source of a lot of interest right now, I'm not sure if that is the final solution. Because we don't want countries to change from being oil importing countries to lithium importing countries, for example, right? So I think going forward, mobility, like we had petrol and diesel before, just 2 options for anybody to use, for mobility options. I think there will probably be many more options in the future because countries will determine what will also be sustainable for them, not just environmentally, but also sustainable for them. So they will look at resources that are available. So for example, for some countries, electric vehicles might not be the solution, but hydrogen vehicles might be the solution, or something else might be the solution. So while in Dubai, for example, electric vehicles is a great idea for the government, right? And when they go for electric vehicles, tomorrow they can use solar energy for electric vehicles. But when a country like India, for example, talks about moving into electric vehicles, big weight, sometimes it worries us because we don't even provide 100% electricity to all households there. To be able to provide for a kind of, huge number of vehicles over there is probably a challenge. So there might be some other solution. So I think each government probably at this point in time needs to figure out what is the right technology that will be going forward for them on a sustainable basis, right? And I think people who are advising these governments should keep in mind that they help them not to copy from some other country. So for example, a solution, that will work great with Europe will probably not work environmentally well with this part of the world, right? So the advisors will play a very, very important role so that they don't copy-paste, but they customize the solution and make it sustainable, for the future. That's all.
I think that's a good point. Ross,
Could I perhaps respond to that? Sorry, I think you talked about the context of sustainability for electric vehicles, and we all think immediately about carbon emissions and pollution, but it's also about sustainability of the economy as well. So a lot of countries, perhaps not so relevant for MIA, but a lot of the countries generate revenue, generate taxes from the sale of petrol and diesel. If you now shift all of that revenue generation, or you take it away and you now adopt electric vehicles, how do the authorities gather revenue to help maintain the infrastructure? So the authorities then need to start looking at alternative ways to generate revenue, whether that's from tolling solutions or per kilometre charging solutions, or perhaps even a tax on electricity for the vehicles, which is a bit of a contrast to what we heard earlier about increasing the adoption of electric vehicles by incentivizing people to take them on. Thank you.
Ross, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Just to pick up on the technology point, I mean, I think it's a really important point. Are we defining the next generation? And the simple advice that we give to our customers and that we try and share with the advisors is, we don't know what's going to happen. 10 years ago, none of us had one of these in our pockets. We don't really know. You've got to get the fundamental principles right. And the fundamental principles are, keep it secure. So you've got to build in cybersecurity from day one. We can all imagine catastrophic situations that result from that. So that has to be baked in from the beginning. But make it open and scalable. No one OEM, no one technology is going to own this space. It's so big. So the principles that you've got to guide by are being secure, being open, and being scalable. And that will help us to get the most out of technology as we go along, I think.
Yeah. And I think that scalability point is a really good one as well, because that will determine where these technologies get rolled out. And at the moment, when we talk about this in a new mobility paradigm, really we're talking about developed markets. We're not talking about the developing markets so much. Certainly in terms of technology, I think maybe in terms of things like sharing, yes, but technology, it's expensive at the moment. So we're really talking about the developed markets. But if it's scalable, suddenly it becomes affordable, much more wider scale. You think?
And makes investments for governments easier. Nobody wants to commit to something that's going to be a white elephant. But if you build it out from a scalable principle, then it makes it easier to do small sort of tests, if you like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd like to take it. Oh, I have questions. Yeah, okay. I'd like to build on that point, but take it in a bit of a different direction. So if we take a step back and we'll look at the cities, design of the cities, we need to understand if we want to build these cities for the people, for the cars, or for the infrastructure. So I like Jaime's perspective on the cities, how they should be built. In my personal view, not necessarily my company's view, in my personal view, they should be built for the cities. They might be as convenient as possible for people to enjoy the walk, to be able to commute, or to be able to get to the office if they live close by. The question is it possible, is it feasible now? And with the number of solutions which we have as of now, with the e-scooters, with the micro-mobility, it's becoming much, much more feasible than even 5 or 10 years ago. So if we're talking about new cities or growing cities, in those areas where new solutions or new infrastructure is possible to be developed in a way that enhances or facilitates micro-mobility, or even getting rid of personal vehicles as such, then, in my personal understanding, that should be the direction. In the cities like Dubai, where we have the roads, where it's difficult to build cycling roads or cycling paths, we need to look at different solutions as well. So I think it's a balance, but ultimately, it seems to me it should be always going back to the end user, to city customers or customers of the mobility services. And that should be the ultimate goal of the mobility services as such.
Yeah, sure.
Hello. Hello, Zaina Nazir, Cities Forum, UK. So I would like the expert's view. You have the major consultants like Parsons, ACOM, I work for you. So I would like to get your views. I know we have a speaker from Karim coming up later, but regarding Uber taking over Karim, I really would love to get your point of view. This region specifically has viewed a lot of I would say, how do you say? When you have like someone, a giant, just owning this monopoly.
Monopoly.
Yeah, I hate this word, that's why I keep forgetting it. So this region had a monopoly a while back, and then we saw a lot of competition, all the major players here, so it makes this region very exciting. But now we're back to monopoly from my point of view, but you might have different point of view. Don't hear Karim's opinion about it, but I really would like your views. What do you think of this purchase?
Well, I can't comment on the acquisition itself, obviously, but you're quite right. By virtue of that acquisition, you then create a single entity which provides this car-sharing service. But you must look at it in the bigger context of the Middle East, and particularly in the city we're in at the moment, Dubai. They're very progressive, very innovative. And I'm sure in the same way that Karim was born in the region, and they're a great challenger to Uber, I'm sure we will see something else emerging out of the back of this acquisition. We'll see new types of mobility, new types of sharing to help challenge what you're suggesting as a total monopoly of the sector. I mean, Didi, for example, were in the news very recently about their plans to take on Uber in other cities around the world. Perhaps we'll see them here any day soon.
But these are not, when you think, I mean, personally, if I ask people here, you know, which apps do they have on their phones in terms of mobility options, you've probably got 1 or 2, maybe 3, and by the time you've gone through the different apps to say which taxi or which vehicle is going to come, you know, you're pretty fed up by that time. So I wouldn't see it necessarily as, I don't really mind. And in fact, the way that the cars operate, as I understand it, is they can work for either of the companies right now. It doesn't actually matter. What I do mind is having it all consolidated into one size, one app, essentially, that answers all my queries. And this brings me on to the next stage. Why just have one just for taxis? You know, why don't we open this up? So this brings me on to the mobility as a service type provision, as in, you know, when I want to travel, when you want to travel and you don't want to use your car, you need to think about all the different options. You know, is there going to be a bus coming? Is there a taxi at the other end? Is there a cycle hire scheme? Is there going to be a bicycle available for me? Ideally, we want it all joined up, one complete approach through one service provider. Now, there are steps being taken towards that in Dubai already. You'll find that RTA has already brought together some of these services into one app. And that, for me, is the important answer. It doesn't matter so much how many different providers there are, as long as we've got a consolidated service that we can operate and make a seamless journey from start to finish. That is more important, in my view.
Yeah. I think, I mean, in terms of innovation and getting away from monopolies, I think what we've already seen is that 10 years ago, there were the automotive companies, and that was pretty much about it. You know, now, when you look at the technology companies coming into the marketplace, I mean, who would have said that Google was going to be a player in the mobility market? Who would have said that Apple was going to be a player in the mobility market? And I'm sure if you asked Ford or GM or Toyota, you know, 15, 20 years ago, who they saw the competitors were, it wouldn't have been the technology companies. And now they're acutely aware that the technology companies are the competition if they're not in fact leading. And Ross, do you have a view on that? You're from a technology company.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And the key is the adaptability, I think, of firms, both in terms of changing within themselves, but also who they partner with and who they work with, who we're able to have discussions with. So there's sort of private commerce to government discussion that happens, but within the private sector ecosystem, those relationships are going to be absolutely key, I think. Which, back to the question about consultants, is an interesting challenge for you guys, I think, because that's, you know, your clients traditionally have bought infrastructure schemes, for example. Is a smart city an IT project or an infrastructure project? It's a little bit of both, and that makes it a very interesting question for them to ask and a very interesting way for you to respond. So I think that's going to be one of the key challenges.
And I guess, again, building your point, Adam, I think it's a very good question, is when you look at what the automotive companies are doing as well, I mean, they've diverted, you know, effort and investment away from just producing vehicles to supplying mobility services, which I think is a profound change in the marketplace over the last 5 or 10 years. I don't think it's necessarily sort of changed how we use mobility, but it's certainly changed the way that they're thinking about how they invest in it.
But it is changing the industry, though. I'm just going to challenge Ross here in that consultants. Yes, Parsons are a consultancy, but we're also a solutions provider, perhaps not so well known in this part of the world. But you're quite right. When we address clients and address projects, we look for the right ecosystem of partners, and I think it's the partnerships that really bring the value to ensure that you address the problems that the client or problem or city has. And you're quite right about the changing economic landscape. If you look at people like Audi, for example, I mean, you think of them as being an automotive manufacturer. Well, in the US, they're now installing traffic lights or intelligent traffic lights, which now communicate with their own vehicles. I think there's 1,000 sites, I think was the last count. Now that's extensive. They're now getting into roadside infrastructure. It's all within the connected/autonomous vehicle ecosystem. But by virtue of the fact that Audi are now starting to provide some of the street furniture and street infrastructure, they're eroding some of the other industry segments.
Yeah.
And I think we will see that more and more as these companies realize that their core market, perhaps of selling vehicles, is starting to be eroded. They're looking outside. They're adapting their business model and adapting how they address the market demands.
Just one small comment, just to address all these points, all very valid points. And I think these kind of consolidation and creation of monopolies or oligopolies in the market are not avoidable at this moment, because on one side we have OEMs or conventional players moving into the new mobility space, but the new mobility is not a big market as of now. So it's still lacking the scale. So if we take standalone companies which are trying to succeed, they're failing as of now. If we took a look at Uber, Careem, I'm not sure, but most of these new players, they are losing money on the business. So unless they consolidate, unless they build the scale, they will not sustain for a long time. So I think this is something we cannot avoid, and we'll see more and more of that. And the announced merger of BMW and Daimler's mobility units is just another example of that.
I think, sorry.
I would agree with him, because what I see is acquisition is more like a seed for innovation. If you see back in early 2000, who was the biggest mobile operator in the world? Nokia was acquiring everyone in the world. And what happened in parallel, Apple were developing their own innovative technology, and they come up with the new technologies. Now Apple thought back in 2015, 16 that they are the leading market player in the world. Now more people are coming. Apple was acquiring almost all the companies. So that's why I always say that acquisition is always a seed for innovation. So once you have the monopoly, which means the competitors will also try to disrupt the market. Because if there's no monopoly and everyone is operating and competing in a conventional platform, obviously there'll be no room for innovation. So I would see this acquisition more of room for innovation.
Yeah, and I don't think we should be crying too much about it, to be honest. I mean, the other side of this is, what we should be worried about is public transit. So, and again, I haven't heard public transit mentioned much today, which has surprised me. So the real worry is that if these schemes and that this new mobility really takes off, public transit as we know it may actually become threatened. And it would really affect the people who rely on it the most. So whilst perhaps the middle classes and so on will be happy to switch from a metro to an Uber or a Careem or something like that, other people may not be so fortunate to have that choice to be able to spend that kind of money. But by taking some of those passengers away from rail, taking them away from buses, it actually means those services are potentially under threat because you don't have that funding coming through. The subsidy level coming from government becomes so much higher that needs to provide it, and you're actually taking away people's opportunity to get to work, to get their kids to school and so on. So my heart really worries more about public transit as a whole, making sure that we protect that, whether it's an Uber, a Careem, or another startup that is going to succeed in the future.
So we'll come to that in a second, as I had a question on that. But before we do, I just wanted to make sure whether we've got any other questions from the audience. Because yes.
Good afternoon. Bijan Majidi, founder and CEO of Dynamica International. I'm one of the unlucky consultants trying to figure out how to make money out of smart city mobility. But I'm also Italian. And after the Romans, who were masters in infrastructure, nothing less. I mean, in Italy, we're still driving in their roads, with their standards, with their limitations. If we talk about infrastructure, and I really liked Jaime's presentation, and we use the analogy of railways, we're still using 100-year-ago standard. And when technology evolves, we ended up in the 60s, I think in 64, the Japanese introduced the fast bullet train. They adapted the existing railway system to their new technology. Still today, the international standardization for railways uses by majority the retrofit of existing railway systems. So my point is, it's very hard to change the way cities, roads, and infrastructure were built and are continuously to build. And Dubai is a very clear example that is not an urban, pedestrian-friendly environment. And whoever is in charge of urban planning is certainly not interested in helping the pedestrian to move from point one to point B. So this legacy matter of infrastructure you can, as the Spanish are doing it, and the Scandinavians in particular are doing it well, is a good example of limit the access to existing old-style infrastructure, regulate it better, punish and give a premium to, but you have to work on alternative solutions. Public transportation, I 100% agree, especially in this part of the world, is seen as a economy class way of traveling rather than business or first class, and this has to be completely overcome, because that's where we have to go. So my point is back to what's the role of the consultants. The real issue here is infrastructure. Jaime says the real solution is infrastructure. So look, how do you measure smart mobility in a city like Dubai? This is, and I would like to know how you measure that to your panel, and what is really your goal in terms of enabling this change in terms of smart mobility? I'm bouncing it back. It's two questions. First, how do you measure success in a city from the pedestrian standpoint of smart mobility? And then how is and what is your knowledge and your effort in accelerating this change? Thank you.
I think it's a great question. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so very quickly,
Okay,
each one of the panel members maybe, how do you measure what success looks like with smart mobility, especially from a kind of livability perspective?
First of all, I wanted to disagree with one of your points, actually. So the point you raised about urban planners forgetting pedestrians, I disagree with fundamentally. So first of all, if you go down the road to Abu Dhabi and walk down the streets like in the center of the city, what they actually went to achieve was to actually give space back to the pedestrians. So what they did was they started to widen the footways. They started to make the, sorry, that's my phone. How embarrassing. Excuse me. So they actually widened the pavements, and they made the right turns much sharper to actually slow the vehicles down, made the vehicles have to lift up to go across crossings. So it's possible. It's achievable here. And a lot of people will say to me that, well, it's too hot here. Why would you even think about encouraging people to come and walk and cycle in the Middle East? Well, a lot of people don't have the choice of what they do. And if you come out with me on a summer's day in the center of Abu Dhabi or in Deira or wherever in Dubai, you will see there are people walking in the city. So there is something that there is a need, there is a demand for this. And the success, if you want to put it like that, is how many more people can we get to move through walking and cycling? Perhaps even on the hottest day of the year, how many more people can we actually get doing that?
Yeah, thank you. Nadeem.
Yeah, I think what I would like to add is, if you see Dubai's transport network or mobility patterns, at least 65% of Dubai's mobility patterns are controlled by developers, not controlled by authorities, okay? And if you see the top developers, I fully agree with you that in the past, I think what they were trying to satisfy, they were trying to satisfy their tick boxes, the standards and all those things. Now developers, we work very close to developers like EMAS and Dubai Holdings, and they are getting very, very, very careful in terms of planning. They are bringing all those international standards and everything. And if you see all the new development which are coming up in Dubai, which you'll see in 5 to 10 years' time, they are very much non-motorized. They have got their own pedestrian pathways. They have got cycle tracks. So they are also promoting it. Again, unless or until the full system promotes it, it's very difficult for any authority to implement it. So I think it's a combined or comprehensive effort which is required for this to happen. So I think unless or until developers come on board, it will be very difficult to achieve. And it's also the funding part of it. The funding part of it, as I said, that we didn't touch on funding, but we were going to discuss funding as well as this technology thing which we have been discussing till now, with all the technological advancement which will happen. Is the biggest challenge which we have here in Dubai or anywhere in the world is, let's say autonomous vehicles come in the future. How autonomous vehicles are going to operate in the basement car parking of Deira? Who is going to pay for those basement car park? Because developer might have already sold the building and is gone out. So authorities are not going to pay for autonomous vehicles or improving the non-motorized tracks or providing transit connectivity to those things. So
Thank you, but my question was how you measure
Yeah.
smart mobility from the urban standpoint, in not a micro, that corner of Abu Dhabi, but in terms of general
Yeah.
approach to
Yeah.
what's happening in the world.
We've got to wrap this up. So
Yeah.
I did just three other comments. Ross, very quickly, how would you measure kind of the success of smart mobility?
Personally, I'm a big fan of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed's fundamental measure, which is happiness. And I think from a mobility point of view, pardon me, that's that your journey is not in any way restricting what you want to do. And from a corporate point of view, our measure on that is, are the use cases driving the technology, or is the technology driving the use cases? And we're still a little bit back to front on that, I think. The technology is there and available, and there's lots of exciting things we do, but we've got to get the coordination and the sort of partner ecosystem together to drive that forward.
Thank you. Vitaly?
I think it's a very good point, and I wanted to go in the same direction. So not so long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, Ford Motors did a study on how many people come to work already stressed because of the driving. So they said the majority of drivers already stressed when they start their work. So to me personally, I would measure that in a way, trying to understand what is the share of drivers or people arriving to work, leaving work, not stressed by the traffic or by congestion, being satisfied by the journey itself. How to achieve that? To me, one of the major questions is how to combine all these multiple options which are available. From my personal experience, not too many people know how to properly combine them, and they think it's very complicated. Today you drive, then you take Kareem, then you go for Uber and so on and so metro or walking. But once they start doing that, it actually becomes pretty useful, pretty convenient, so they try to move in that direction as well.
Very good. I can have
Andrew?
perhaps time, but I'll be very brief. Back to your question about how do we measure the success of smart mobility within a city, and we've heard lots of different views here, but personally, I don't think there's one answer for that. I don't think we can say it's livability or happiness. It depends what the city is trying to achieve by doing it. So are they trying to generate revenue, for example? Are they trying to reduce the pollutants in the atmosphere? Are they simply trying to encourage the use of their mass transit system they've invested billions of dollars building? Are they trying to encourage better use of the roadways and reduce congestion on the roadways? And I think it comes back to the point we made at the start about the personalization of what the client ultimately is trying to achieve. I think if you look at it globally across all of the different aspects of smart mobility, I think that's an incredible challenge, and that will be a significant one to overcome.
If I may, a good question, but again, my point of view was from the pedestrian standpoint and not the city player. From the pedestrian standpoint, if I may give an analogy, if I want to book a travel ticket from point A to point B, I may consider two things: the faster route or the cheapest route. And when you go the cheapest, sometimes you travel instead of 8 hours, could be 28 hours. But if you are a thrifty traveler, you may decide, I want to go the cheaper route no matter what, and I go 28 hours instead of 8 hours. Now, when we are moving from point A to point B, and multimodal mobility probably is the solution, but as a pedestrian, I may decide I want to go the fastest route, I may want to go the most comfortable route, or I want to go the cheapest route, which I don't have a problem with being packed like sardines in a tube or things like that. So that's why I asked to understand, because then again, once you interpret that as a general goal of the single individual, and then you make policy as a city planner or a mayor or as a legislator, then you go back, and technology plays its role, planning plays its role, but the starting point is the individual. And we know that, for example, and I close here, America for years developed transportation vehicle-centric. Drive through, bank through, eat through, cinema through, and now they're changing, obviously. So this was my point. Thank you for your answers. Thank you very much.
I'll just wrap up very quickly and just finish actually with an example, I think, of what the sort of thing you're talking about, which is that I was having a discussion with somebody in the city of Glasgow who was developing their smart city initiatives. And one of the things they did was to open up all of Glasgow's data sets. So people could create apps to do whatever they wanted to do out of those data sets. He said one of the applications that was most popular was actually a cycling app, where somebody had taken the mapping data and a whole range of other data sets, and had not only created an app that got people from A to B on a bike the quickest, or the shortest route, but you can also overlap data with things like pollution. So you can cycle the least polluted route, which for some people is important. Or you could cycle the safest route. So if you've got accident data, you can map that on as well and say, I want to cycle the safest route. So I think, to your point, personalization is key, but personalization means different things to different people. And it's how we sort of allow that to happen in a sustainable way. But first of all, I'd like to thank the panel for a wonderful range of different perspectives. I think we had a good discussion. Also to thank the audience for some excellent questions as well, which I think fueled some of that. So I think we're out of time, unfortunately. But just to wrap up, I mean, one of the things for me is, interestingly, we're talking about sort of smart mobility and technology, but we always seem to come back to infrastructure. So I think Jaime had a real point in his presentation. The partnerships, I think, will be key in terms of technology and traditional and new players. Doesn't feel like we're really at a tipping point from what people are saying. It will be more evolution rather than revolution. And to finally wrap up, personalization seems to be the thing that will drive the success or not of the future mobility landscape. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aki.
Yeah.